revolutionary like I'm Huey Newton. Che Guevara when them bullets start shooting.
Hello comrades, and welcome to yet another episode of Communism for Beginners. So now we are on the first chapter of Foundations of Leninism. So the historical roots of Leninism. Now this is a pretty short chapter, and it's also pretty self-explanatory, and it also covers a lot of the stuff that we already covered in the last video, because it talks about the introduction talked about the definition of Leninism, and this talks about the historical roots. So there's a lot of the same thing, lots of stuff about imperialism and so forth. I have again taken a long quote. I want to focus on this one quote, pretty long quote, and then where Stalin talks about the three contradictions of imperialism, and then there's one other thing which I want to cover, which is social chauvinism and social pacifism, which he also mentions, because that might be confusing. So this quote, it says, Lenin called imperialism moribund capitalism. Why? And in case you don't know what moribund means, it means that it's like decaying and dying. I didn't actually even know that. I had to look that up. Maybe English speakers think it's obvious, but I've never heard that word before. Anyway, because imperialism carries the contradictions of capitalism to their last bounds, to the extreme limit beyond which revolution begins. Of these contradictions, there are three which must be regarded as the most important. The first contradiction is the contradiction between labor and capital. Imperialism is the omnipotence of the monopolist trusts and syndicates, of the banks and the financial oligarchy in the industrial countries. In the fight against this omnipotence, the customary methods of the working class, trade unions and cooperatives, parliamentary parties, and the parliamentary struggle have proved to be totally inadequate. Either place yourself at the mercy of capital, eke out a wretched existence as of old and sink lower and lower, or adopt a new weapon. This is the alternative imperialism puts before the vast masses of the proletariat. Imperialism brings the working class to revolution. So there's quite a lot of stuff there. So first it talks about imperialism is the omnipotence of monopolists and monopolist trust and syndicates, banks and the financial oligarchy in the industrial countries. So I didn't actually explain like that well what imperialism was last time, because people don't understand that modern imperialism is not typically like colonialism. It's, even though in Lenin's time, like, there were still plenty of colonies. I mean, even today there are colonies, but they are not those old school colonies. These days it's mostly neo-colonialism, but even back then, when there were still colonies, when they talk about imperialism, they don't really talk about colonialism, because imperialism is mainly economic in character. It's not that you go over there and you take over and you conquer them. It's more about you want to take over their markets. American corporations, American trusts and syndicates, monopolies, want to go over there. They want to invest in those countries. For example, in some African country, they want to invest because the labor is cheap. They want the cheap labor. There's a lot of raw materials, so they want to take those raw materials. And there's also new markets. There's new markets where there's consumers, and they want to take over those markets so they can sell their stuff and get profits. So that's really what imperialism is, and the military aspect only comes into play if there's something that stops them from investing. Like if the country, if they, for example, they have like nationalized their oil industry, then the United States might, like, for example, look at examples of Venezuela or Iraq. When Venezuela nationalized their oil, the United States tried to use a CIA coup d'etat, CIA coup to overthrow the democratically elected president of Venezuela, because he had nationalized their oil, so American corporations couldn't really benefit anymore from it that much. They were beginning to use the oil for their own the benefit of their own population, as opposed to the capitalists. So they will put sanctions on the country. They will try using coups and stuff like that, or they will outright invade the country. But the actual invasion, the actual coup, the sanctions, that's not really the imperialist part. That's something imperialism does, but the actual imperialist action is when they invest in the country and start to exploit the labor and the resources and take over the markets. Then in the quote, it says that the customary methods of the working class, trade unions and cooperatives, parliamentary parties and parliamentary struggle have proved to be totally inadequate. So this typical labor movement idea, let's just have a strike and have trade union stuff and then we'll improve our conditions. No, that's not gonna work anymore. And the parliamentary struggle, that's not gonna, any kind of reformism, that's not gonna work anymore. Revolution is the only thing that's actually gonna change anything permanently. So imperialism brings the working class to revolution. And then he continues, the second contradiction is the contradiction among the various financial groups and imperialist powers in their struggle for sources of raw materials for foreign territory. Imperialism is the export of capital to the sources of raw materials. That is a really good definition. Imperialism is the export of capital to the source of raw materials, which means export of capital means the country, they've invested in their own country so much that it doesn't really make sense anymore. They have so much capital that they got more than what they can invest in their own country, so they're like, we have to export this capital, which means we have to invest abroad, and that is when imperialism starts to happen. The frenzied struggle for monopolist possession of these sources, the struggle for a redivision of already divided world, a struggle waged with particular fury by new financial groups and powers seeking a place in the sun against the old groups and powers which cling tenaciously to what they have seized. This frenzied struggle among the various groups of capitalists is notable in that it includes as an inevitable element imperialist wars of the annexation of foreign territory. This circumstance in its turn is notable in that it leads to the mutual weakening of the imperialists, to the weakening of the position of the capitalism in general, to the acceleration of the advent of the proletarian revolution, and to the practical necessity of this revolution. That is important to note, that the First World War was the first modern imperialist war, because that was the first time in human history that pretty much all places on Earth had been conquered by someone. So there were no more new colonies to take over, so the only thing that these imperialists could do, because there were various groups of imperialists, like imperialist capitalists, monopoly capitalists in Great Britain, in France, Germany, and they all were like, we got this extra capital we want to export, but we need more colonies. We have kind of exhausted the potentials of our colonies. We want more colonies, but there were no other places to conquer anymore. Everything had already been taken, so they were like, well, we're gonna have to try to take the colonies away from these other countries. So it became, like he says, the struggle for a redivision of the already divided world, a redivision of the colonies, and it leads to, as an inevitable element, imperialist wars. So modern wars, they're really imperialist wars. Imperialism is what causes these wars. Wars don't happen by accident. Wars don't happen because, there's some religious holy war, or we want to spread democracy, we want to spread freedom. No, that's not what happens. It's there's economic interest behind those. Like, what do you think the United States has invaded or had a CIA coup d'etat or some kind of intervention in pretty much every South American country? Do you think they all somehow threatened the United States, or do you think the United States Like what do you think is going on there? It's economic interests. Like the United States said they need to help Cuba against the Spanish, so therefore what did they do? Well, they invaded. They created this idea that they're trying to give Cuba democracy from being a Spanish colony, but then all of a sudden they invaded the Philippines, which was another Spanish colony, but that had nothing to do with democracy or nothing to do with Cuba. It had everything to do with the whole thing about giving Cuba democracy was all about just trying to take over the stuff that Spain had. So they took Spain's colonies, the Philippines, Cuba, and then they took like Puerto Rico, and there's just countless examples of these imperialist wars happening. The wars don't happen because there's like some humanitarian reason. No, it's economic interests. And he continues, the third contradiction is the contradiction between the handful of ruling civilized nations and the hundreds of millions of the colonial and dependent peoples of the world. Imperialism is the most barefaced exploitation and the most inhumane oppression of hundreds of millions of people inhabiting vast colonies and dependent countries. So this is like so true, even today. Like this is so clearly obvious even today. Not only is there like a massive contradiction between there's workers and capitalists, then there's inter-imperialist rivalry, which the second contradiction that he brings up, and then the third contradiction, which is also pretty massive, which is the so-called the handful of ruling quote-unquote civilized nations, Western countries, Western industrial capitalist countries, Western imperialist countries, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, France, Germany, and then the majority of the planet, which is third world countries, colonies, neo-colonies, and dependent countries. And back then there were like actual colonies. Today, not so much. I mean, there's like Ireland and Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and these actual like literal colonies that these other countries have conquered and that they still have. But there's a lot of the colonies got independence relatively recently, or they got quote unquote independence. The British left India, and Portugal and France. Like France left Upper Volta, which began to be known as Burkina Faso, and they left French Indochina, which became known as Vietnam. So these countries got independence, but they're still dependent countries in that the French and the British and the Americans, they own all the large corporations that control the economies of these countries. The Western countries own those. They control the markets of these countries. They control the resources. They exploit the super cheap labor in like semi-slave conditions. They tell the corrupt bureaucrats and corrupt presidents and leaders of these African countries, the imperialists tell them what they have to do if they want to stay in power, and in return the imperialists will make sure that their populations can't overthrow their corrupt puppet leaders. Which is, just look at the Philippines for example. The United States is sending increased amounts of military training and equipment and troops and materials to the Philippines because the population of the Philippines is rebelling against the US-backed puppet government. Despite the fact that these countries now have nominal independence, they are still completely dependent on these imperialist countries, which control their economies. Which these African countries, they have crazy amounts of debt to their former colonial masters, which is like so fucking sick. The imperialist countries should have paid like massive reparations to these countries, but instead they like give them aid and loans, and then they're like completely dependent on them because they need the loans and they need the aid, and they're like in crazy amounts of debt to these Western imperialists. But let's continue. The purpose of this exploitation and of this oppression is to squeeze out super profits. So imperialism produces super profits. It's not just capitalists exploiting the workers, getting some profits. It's they exploit them and get super profits because they go to countries where labor is really cheap, where you don't have to worry about any kind of like regulations. There's no 8-hour working day or anything. Then because the living standards here in the West are better, the prices are higher. It's really messed up how the actual majority of the production actually happens in the third world, but the majority of the consumption actually happens in the first world, because the first world is where all the money is, where people have the money, so therefore most of the demand for these consumer products is here in the West. So they invest in the third world, they create these cheap products, and they ship them back here to the first world, and they sell them, despite the fact that they have been made super cheap, they still sell them at really expensive prices here in the West. So they get super profits as opposed to just regular profits. But in exploiting these countries, imperialism is compelled to build these railways, factories and mills, industrial and commercial centers. The appearance of a class of proletarians, the emergence of a native intelligentsia, the awakening of national consciousness, the growth of the liberation movement, such are the inevitable results of this policy. So there's a lot of stuff there. So imperialism helps kinda to develop the industry of these countries in a way. In the pre-imperialist era, capitalism developed kinda like gradually and organically, but now in the imperialist era it develops really unevenly and sporadically. So in these countries like India, where there's basically a lot of like completely feudal economy going on, there's still these really gigantic modern industrial plants, because it didn't develop gradually and organically. It was brought there. The growth of the revolutionary movement in all colonies and dependent countries without exception clearly testifies to this fact. The circumstance is of importance for the proletariat inasmuch as it saps radically the position of capitalism by converting the colonies and dependent countries from reserves of imperialism into reserves of the proletarian revolution. So yeah, it creates national liberation movements and revolutionary situations and potentials. That is why a good bulk of the socialist world was actually former colonies, like Cuba. China was also partially a colony of the British and of Japan. Korea was a Japanese colony. Vietnam was a French colony, together with Laos and Cambodia and, as I said, Burkina Faso and Angola. That is the historical roots of Leninism. I mostly focused on the imperialism issue because Leninism is, as he said, it's the Marxism of the era of imperialism. There was this one other thing that I wanted to cover, which was, it talks about social pacifism and social chauvinism. Social chauvinism was when, because this talks a lot about the First World War, so the social chauvinism came to the forefront in the First World War, when basically a lot of the socialists, or so-called socialists and anarcho-syndicalists and people like that, they supported their own governments, their own capitalist governments. They were like, we are socialists, but because we oppose like French imperialism, we support our German government or something. When their own governments were just as bad as the foreign governments, but they sided with their own governments because it was their own government. So that's social chauvinism. It goes completely against Marxism. It goes completely against internationalism, and that's why Lenin argued against it. And then social pacifism was when it was kind of similar. It was this thing that developed when there was like some semblance of hope for peace. Then these certain people, these social pacifists, they argued that we should, try to like negotiate peace and something. Like, it was just a different brand of social chauvinism, really. But yeah, that was that. And next time we will talk about chapter 2, method. So that should be interesting. Okay, bye now.